always knew Ethan was weak. Not weak in the obvious sense. He wasn't a coward or physically feeble. No, Ethan was weak in the way that mattered most. He lacked ambition, drive, and the ability to take charge of his own life. He was comfortable being mediocre, satisfied with just getting by. And I hated him for it. When we first married, I thought he would grow into the kind of man I could truly respect. But as the years went by, nothing changed. While I climbed the corporate ladder, he stayed in his safe little job as a freelance web developer, bringing in just enough to keep up appearances but never enough to elevate our lives. I was the one who bought the house. I was the one who made the real money. And I was the one who held all the power in our marriage. At least that's what I thought. The affair was just a symptom. When I first started seeing David, it wasn't about love or even lust, it was about validation. David was everything Ethan wasn't. Powerful, wealthy, charismatic. He didn't fumble with bills or hesitate when ordering expensive wine. He commanded a room effortlessly, and when he looked at me, I felt like the most desirable woman in the world. It started as harmless flirting during our late meetings at the office. Then one night after a business trip it happened. A hotel suite. A bottle of wine. A moment of weakness. After that, I told myself it was a one-time mistake. But it never stopped. David was intoxicating, and being with him reminded me of everything Ethan wasn't. It made me resent my husband even more. Ethan, of course, was completely oblivious. I didn't even have to try to cover my tracks. He never questioned my late nights, my sudden interest in lingerie, or my weekend work retreats. He was too trusting, too naive, too weak. The power move. I had thought about leaving him before, but every time I told myself it wasn't worth the hassle. Divorce would mean paperwork, asset division, and the exhausting process of finding a new place to live. And honestly, I didn't think Ethan could survive without me. I figured he needed me too much to ever leave. So I held all the cards. Or at least I thought I did. Then one evening as we sat in our cold, silent dining room, me scrolling through emails on my phone, Ethan picking at his food, I decided to test him. I had divorce papers drawn up, I said casually, taking a sip of my wine. Ethan didn't even flinch. He just blinked at me, his fork frozen midair. I smirked. Don't look so surprised. It's not like things have been great between us. And let's be real, Ethan, you wouldn't be able to afford a divorce anyway. I leaned back in my chair, waiting for him to crumble under the weight of my words. I mean, do you even have the money for a lawyer? Or for a new place? Let's be honest, you rely on me for everything. He stared at me for a long moment and then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And for the first time in our marriage, I felt something I never had before. Doubt. His move. Is that so? Ethan's voice was calm. Too calm. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. So if I'm so dependent on you, why don't I just sign the papers? I faltered. What? Give them to me. He reached out his hand. Let's do it now. I laughed, but it came out more nervous than I intended. Ethan, come on, I was just making a point. Hand them over, Claire. The way he said my name sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, but then out of sheer arrogance I did it. I pulled the crisp, neatly folded divorce papers from my purse, slid them across the table, and watched as Ethan picked them up without a moment's hesitation. And then to my utter shock, he signed them. Right then and there. The pen barely made a sound against the paper, but in my head it was deafening. When he finished, he stood up, slid the papers into a folder, and grabbed his jacket. I'll submit these in the morning, he said simply. Then just like that he walked out. No hesitation. No pleading. No second guesses. And for the first time in my life I realized, maybe I wasn't the one holding the power after all. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the door Ethan had just walked through. He was bluffing. He had to be. There was no way he'd actually submit the papers. Not Ethan. Not the man who always let me have the final word, who avoided confrontation like it was the plague. He was probably just trying to scare me, to rattle me for daring to throw the divorce in his face. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, an unsettling feeling settled into my chest. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't begged. He hadn't even looked hurt. I picked up my wine glass with slightly trembling fingers and took a long sip, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe I had miscalculated. Maybe I had pushed too hard. But no, I refused to believe that. Ethan needed me. A moment of weakness. A part of me wanted to call him, but my pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, I turned to the one thing that always made me feel better, David. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through our messages. His last text was from earlier that afternoon. David, you're free Friday night, right? Thinking of getting a suite again. I smiled to myself, already feeling my confidence return. David wouldn't let me feel small. David knew my worth. Me, of course. Can't wait. He replied almost instantly. David, I'll take care of everything, babe. Just show up looking as stunning as always. I let out a slow breath, relaxing a little. Ethan might have surprised me, but he was still Ethan, passive, predictable, and incapable of functioning without me. If he thought he could walk away just like that, he'd soon realize how much he relied on me. And when he did, I'd be the one deciding how this marriage ended. The next morning, I woke up to an empty bed. Ethan usually left early to work from a coffee shop, but something about today felt different. I padded downstairs, my silk robe tied loosely around me, and poured myself a cup of coffee. The house felt unusually quiet. Then I saw it. The folder with the divorce papers was gone. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my phone and dialed Ethan's number. It rang. And rang. And rang. Voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Still nothing. A small pit of worry formed in my gut, but I shoved it down. He was just trying to mess with me. That's what this was. I threw on a sleek black dress, slipped into my designer heels and grabbed my purse. If Ethan wanted to play games, fine. But I had a meeting, and I wasn't about to let his little tantrum ruin my day. By the time I got to the office, I had already convinced myself that he would come crawling back by the end of the day. He always did. Reality hits hard. It wasn't until lunchtime that everything unraveled. I was sitting in my office finishing up an email when my phone buzzed. I expected it to be David, but instead it was my best friend, Kelsey. Kelsey, girl. What the hell is going on? I frowned, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Me? What do you mean? A few seconds later she sent a screenshot. My heart stopped. It was a court confirmation. A case filing notice. Petitioner, Ethan Carter. Respondent, Claire Carter. I felt the blood drain from my face. He had actually submitted them. My hands trembled as I reread the text over and over, as if doing so would somehow change the words staring back at me. Ethan filed for divorce. He wasn't bluffing. He actually went through with it. The fear sets in. I scrambled to dial his number again, but this time it didn't even ring. Straight to voicemail. Panic rose in my throat. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He was supposed to break down, beg, fight for me. He was supposed to realize that I held all the power, that he couldn't just walk away. Instead he left. No pleading. No second chances. Just a quiet exit. I forced myself to take a deep breath. Okay, this wasn't a total loss. Divorce filings didn't mean the marriage was over. There were still negotiations, paperwork, things that needed to be settled. I could still salvage this, still make him regret ever daring to leave me. I just needed to get ahead of it. But for the first time a sliver of doubt crept in. Because if Ethan was capable of walking away so easily, maybe I never had control over him in the first place. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze, my mind racing in circles. The court filing sat like a boulder in my chest, making it hard to breathe. Ethan had actually filed. The man I thought I had wrapped around my little finger, the man who was supposed to need me, had walked away without so much as a second glance. I refused to believe it. No, this was a stunt. A power move. He wanted to shake me, and maybe for a moment it had worked. But I wasn't about to let him think he had the upper hand. I had built this marriage. I had carried us financially, socially, everything. Ethan had been nothing more than a passenger, coasting through the life I made possible. And now he thought he could just leave? I wasn't going to let him. Damage control. By the time I left the office I had a plan. First I called my lawyer. Claire, I just got the filing, Melissa said the moment she picked up. We need to. I need you to stall, I interrupted. Drag this out. I don't care how, just make sure nothing gets finalized too quickly. Melissa hesitated. Claire, are you trying to fight this? I swallowed hard. I need time to figure things out. A pause. Then a quiet sigh. I can slow things down, but Ethan's playing this smart. He filed clean. No major disputes, no financial complications. Financial complications? I let out a bitter laugh. Melissa, be serious. Ethan can't afford a divorce. He barely makes enough to cover his own expenses. The moment he realizes how expensive it is to separate from me, he'll cave. Another silence. This time longer. What? I snapped. Melissa cleared her throat. Claire, I don't know how to tell you this, but Ethan hired one of the best divorce attorneys in the city. I froze. What? Gavin Reed, she said. Top tier, aggressive, and expensive. My mouth went dry. That didn't make sense. Ethan couldn't afford a lawyer like that. His entire income for the year wouldn't be enough to cover Gavin Reed's retainer. I inhaled sharply, my mind scrambling for an answer. Had he borrowed money? Taken out a loan? No, Ethan never made financial decisions without overanalyzing every angle. He was careful, cautious to a fault. So how the hell was he affording an elite attorney? For the first time since this started, I felt real fear slither through me. What else didn't I know? I pulled into the driveway, barely remembering the drive home. The house was dark when I walked in, Ethan's usual routine. He liked to work late, sometimes in the guest room, sometimes in the garage where he kept his old project car. But tonight he wasn't home. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Something wasn't right. I marched upstairs straight into our bedroom and yanked open his closet. His side was half empty, several of his shirts, jackets, and shoes were gone. I rushed to the bathroom. His razor, toothbrush, cologne, all missing. Panic clawed at my throat. Ethan wasn't just trying to scare me. He was really leaving. The lies I told myself. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the silk sheets in my fists. This wasn't happening. He didn't have the money. He didn't have the guts. He didn't have the knowledge. I stiffened. He didn't know about David. He couldn't. If he had known, he wouldn't have just filed. He would have burned my life to the ground. Ethan was quiet, but he wasn't stupid. If he had proof of my affair, he would have used it. Wouldn't he? I exhaled shakily, trying to center myself. This was still salvageable. Ethan was just reacting emotionally. That's what this was. He would come back. He had to. As if he didn't, I wasn't sure what I would do. The phone call that changed everything. I barely slept that night. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind outside, had me sitting up in bed, hoping to hear the front door open. But it never did. By morning my nerves were shot. I called him again. Voicemail. I sent a text. No response. By noon, I had resorted to calling Kelsey again. I don't know what to do, I admitted, pacing my office. He's completely ignoring me. Kelsey sighed. Claire, you wanted out of this marriage. You literally waved divorce papers in his face. I didn't think he'd actually sign them. I snapped, rubbing my temples. Well, welcome to reality. I bit my lip, unsure of what to say. Then Kelsey hesitated. Listen. I wasn't going to say anything, but I saw Ethan last night. I froze mid-step. Where? At a bar downtown. He was with a couple of guys I didn't recognize. And Claire, she paused. He looked good. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell does that mean? I mean, he wasn't sulking or drinking himself into oblivion. He looked relaxed. Confident. Like he had a plan. A pit opened in my stomach. Ethan wasn't supposed to thrive without me. He was supposed to be broken, lost, desperate to fix things. Instead, he was out drinking, celebrating. Like this divorce was the best thing that ever happened to him. The realization I couldn't ignore. I ended the call, my mind spiraling. I had spent years looking down on Ethan. Years thinking he was just a passenger in my life. Someone who would never leave because he couldn't survive without me. But I had been wrong. So very, very wrong. Because the man I thought I had control over, he had just walked away like I was nothing. And for the first time in my life, I felt what it was like to be on the losing side. The world around me was unraveling, and I had no idea how to stop it. Ethan wasn't coming home. That fact sat like a stone in my gut as I paced the kitchen, my perfectly manicured nails tapping against the cool marble countertop. The coffee I had made sat untouched, growing cold beside me. My phone lay face up, screen dark, mocking me with its silence. He still hadn't called. He still hadn't texted. I had expected anger. I had expected resistance. I had even braced myself for the possibility of an argument, some kind of emotional confrontation where I could pull the strings and manipulate him back under my control. But what I hadn't expected: indifference. Ethan was fine. Worse, he was thriving. The power shift. I thought back to Kelsey's words. He looked good. Like he had a plan. That single sentence had done something to me, something I didn't like. It made me feel vulnerable. Exposed. Because Ethan was never the one with the plan. I was the one who made the decisions, the one who controlled our future, our finances, our life together. I had spent years believing he was just along for the ride, that he needed me, that I was better than him. And now he was moving on like I had never mattered. No begging. No fighting. No pathetic last attempt to win me back. He had simply signed the papers and left. That wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to be the one left behind. David's reassurance. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my phone and texted the only person who could remind me of my worth. Me drinks tonight? David's response was almost instant. David. Absolutely. 8 p.m. my place? I exhaled in relief. Yes. That's what I needed. A night with David, a reminder that I was still wanted, still desired. Ethan was a mistake, a burden I had carried for far too long. And if he thought he could just walk away and win, he had another thing coming. The unexpected encounter. By the time I arrived at David's luxury apartment downtown, my nerves had settled. The doorman greeted me with a polite nod, already familiar with my face. David and I had been meeting here for months, away from prying eyes, away from the life I was supposed to have with Ethan. I stepped into the elevator, adjusting the thin strap of my black dress, checking my reflection in the mirrored walls. I looked good, stunning even. Ethan might have left, but I was still me. Powerful. Desirable. Unshaken. Or at least that's what I told myself. The elevator dinged, doors sliding open. I stepped out, walking with practiced confidence toward David's penthouse. And then I froze. Because standing at David's door, buttoning his expensive suit jacket, was Ethan. For a moment my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My husband, my soon-to-be ex-husband, was standing outside my lover's apartment, looking completely at ease. No anger. No confrontation. Just calm. He glanced up, meeting my wide-eyed stare, and smirked. Smirked. Like he knew something I didn't. Hello, Claire. My throat tightened. I struggled to find words, to understand what the hell was happening. Ethan had never met David. He didn't even know about him, he couldn't. So what the hell was he doing here? David's door opened behind him, and my lover's familiar voice filled the hallway. Ethan, it was good seeing you. Let's talk next week. What? David, my David, was shaking hands with my husband, like they were colleagues, like they were friends. I felt my stomach drop. Ethan turned back to me, amusement flickering in his eyes. Didn't expect to see me here, did you? I opened my mouth but nothing came out. David's gaze flicked between us, then settled on me with an unreadable expression. Claire, he greeted smoothly, stepping aside. Come in. But I couldn't move. Because suddenly I was realizing something terrible. I didn't know Ethan at all. The truth I never saw coming. Ethan took a slow step forward, closing the distance between us. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't hesitant. He was in control. For the first time in our entire marriage, he was the one holding all the power. And that terrified me. You look surprised, he murmured, his smirk widening. Did you really think I didn't know? My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear him. David? Ethan? What the hell was going on? My voice cracked. How? Ethan's eyes gleamed. Claire, he said softly, tilting his head. Did you really think you were the only one with secrets? I had spent years believing I was the smartest person in the room, believing that I was always one step ahead, always in control. But standing in the dimly lit hallway of David's penthouse, watching my soon-to-be ex-husband shake hands with my lover, I felt something foreign creep up my spine. Panic. Ethan shouldn't have been here. He couldn't have known. Yet here he was, looking completely at ease, as if this had all been planned. David's voice broke the tense silence. Claire. I tore my eyes away from Ethan and turned to him. He was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The man who had always made me feel desired, powerful, untouchable, now looked at me as if I were a stranger. My stomach twisted. What the hell is going on? I demanded, forcing my voice to stay steady. Ethan chuckled. A low, amused sound that made my skin prickle. Come inside, David said. Not an invitation. A command. And for the first time in my life I hesitated. But I had no choice. I stepped inside. The walls close in. The penthouse was as sleek and modern as always. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture. A stocked bar in the corner. A place of luxury, power, secrecy. But tonight it felt suffocating. Ethan strolled in behind me, casual as ever, like he belonged here. Like he'd been here before. David poured himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before looking up. We should talk. I crossed my arms, trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Someone better start explaining. I snapped. Because I'm getting really tired of whatever game this is. Ethan leaned against the bar, smirking. Oh, Claire, he murmured. You're not the one playing the game anymore. The setup. David sighed and set his drink down. When exactly were you planning to tell me about the divorce? He asked, his voice even. My pulse spiked. I forced a scoff. Why does that matter? David gave me a cold, knowing look. Because I don't appreciate being lied to. I swallowed hard. This wasn't right. David had always been my escape, my safe haven. My ally. He chose me over his wife, over ethics, over everything. But now? Now he was looking at me like I was the problem. Wait a second, I said slowly, glancing between the two men. Are you two? How the hell do you even know each other? Ethan smiled, slow and deliberate. David's company has been handling my investment portfolio for over a year now. The words hit like a slap. My breath caught. Investment portfolio? Ethan nodded. See, Claire, while you were busy assuming I was some broke, helpless fool, I was making moves of my own. My mind raced. What investment portfolio? Ethan never made financial decisions without discussing them with me. I controlled our money. I monitored his accounts. Didn't I? You don't have money, I scoffed, but my voice faltered. You wouldn't even be able to afford. Oh, you mean my lawyer? Ethan interrupted smoothly. Yeah, about that. He tilted his head, watching my reaction like a predator toying with its prey. I've been working with David for months. He set up my investments, helped me grow my savings, and even advised me on how to protect my assets before filing for divorce. David swirled his drink. Smart move, honestly. My hands clenched into fists. This couldn't be real. No, I said, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. I would have known. Would you? Ethan cut in. Because here's the thing, Claire. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You were so busy looking down on me that you never once bothered to look at me. The air left my lungs. The realization that broke me. Everything tilted. I had spent years telling myself Ethan was weak, passive, nothing without me. And the entire time, he had been planning his escape. I thought I was the one cheating the system, that I had both men wrapped around my finger. But I wasn't the one playing chess. I was the pawn. And Ethan had just made his final move. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. You, I whispered. You set me up. Ethan smirked. I just waited for you to do what I knew you'd do. I shook my head. That's not predictable, Claire. Ethan continued, his voice calm, controlled. You thought you had all the power. But you never even considered that I might have been waiting for the right moment to take it from you. And then he said the words that destroyed me. I don't need you. It was worse than anger. Worse than hate. Because Ethan wasn't trying to hurt me. He had already moved on. Checkmate. David sighed and stood, adjusting his cufflinks. I think we're done here. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He had already dismissed me. Ethan, on the other hand, gave me one last look. A look that said everything. He had one. And I had never even seen it coming. The silence in David's penthouse was suffocating. Not a silence of comfort or familiarity, but one filled with finality. Ethan had just ripped the ground out from under me, And David, my David, wasn't even trying to soften the blow. I had lost, and I had never even seen the game being played. Cold goodbye. David adjusted his cufflinks, then turned to Ethan. Let's touch base next week. Ethan nodded, like I wasn't even standing there, like I didn't matter. I turned to David, desperate to salvage something. David, you're really going to throw me aside just like that? My voice was sharper than I intended, edged with panic. David sighed, looking at me with something bordering annoyance. Claire, he said evenly, this wasn't personal. Not personal. I let out a bitter laugh. Not personal? You've been sleeping with me for months, lying to your wife, and now suddenly I'm disposable. David didn't flinch. You knew what this was. The words hit harder than I expected. I opened my mouth then closed it. Because he was right. David had never made promises. Never whispered about a future together. I had told myself a story that never existed. And now it was over. Just like that. The walk of shame. Ethan turned toward the door, his posture relaxed, as if none of this affected him. I watched him, my heart pounding. He was leaving. And I, Claire Carter, the woman who always held the upper hand, was powerless to stop him. I didn't even realize I was moving until my fingers wrapped around his wrist. Ethan, I breathed, my voice no longer sharp. Wait. He turned slowly, his blue eyes meeting mine. For the first time in years I saw him clearly. Not the passive, dependent man I had convinced myself he was. Not the weak, clueless husband I had been so sure would never leave me. But a man who had already left. His voice was gentle, almost pitying. There's nothing left to say, Claire. I shook my head. No, that's not true. I needed to fix this. Somehow. Because if Ethan really walked away, if he really meant it, I didn't know who I would be without him to look down on. Ethan, please. The word felt foreign, unnatural coming from my lips. But for the first time I meant it. His gaze flickered with something I couldn't name. Maybe regret. Maybe disgust. Maybe nothing at all. Then he gently pried my fingers from his wrist and took a step back. Goodbye, Claire. And just like that, he was gone. Left behind. The door shut behind him, and I felt it like a punch to the stomach. I turned to David, desperate for something. Anything to hold on to. But he was already heading toward the bar, fixing himself another drink. David. This conversation is over, Claire. Just like that. The realization settled in. I had lost everything. I had spent years believing Ethan needed me. That I was the one with all the control, all the power. But the truth? I needed him. And now I had nothing. No husband. No lover. No one left to believe my own lie. The last stand. I stumbled out of David's apartment in a daze. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. My world had collapsed in a single night. And for the first time I didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear. Ethan had won. And I couldn't live with that. The drive home was a blur. I don't even remember getting into my car or pulling onto the road, but suddenly I was there. Sitting in my driveway, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The house was dark. Empty. For the first time it truly hit me. Ethan wasn't coming back. There was no fight left to win. No arguments to manipulate. No control left to wield. I had spent years looking down on him, believing he would always be there. Always waiting for me to decide what our future looked like. And now? I was alone. The lies I wanted to believe. I got out of the car and stepped inside, the silence swallowing me whole. No faint glow from Ethan's home office. No soft sound of his typing. No coffee mug left on the counter. Nothing. I took off my heels, the click of them against the floor suddenly too loud. I needed a drink. I walked to the bar, pouring myself a glass of wine with shaking hands. This was fine. I was fine. Ethan would come to his senses. He had to. He'd realize life without me wasn't what he thought it would be. He'd struggle, and when he did, he'd regret ever walking away. I just had to wait. That was what I told myself as I sipped my wine. A lie I desperately needed to believe. The reality I couldn't ignore. By morning I couldn't sit still. I tried to go about my day as if everything was normal. But every moment felt wrong. Breakfast alone. No good morning texts. No sign that Ethan had ever existed in this house. I lasted until noon before my pride cracked. I grabbed my phone and called him. It rang. And rang. And rang. Voicemail. I hung up, then immediately called again. Nothing. Panic clawed its way into my chest. Ethan never ignored me. Never. I typed out a text, my fingers moving faster than my brain. We need to talk. Can you come by tonight? I stared at the message, waiting for the little dots to appear. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Still no response. I tried again. Ethan, don't be childish. We should discuss this like adults. Still nothing. I slammed my phone onto the counter, my frustration bubbling into anger. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Ethan wasn't the one who walked away. I was. The warning I didn't listen to. By the time evening rolled around, I was done waiting. I got in my car and drove straight to his new apartment. It wasn't hard to find. I had looked it up the moment I got the court filing. Ethan had moved into a sleek, modern complex on the other side of town. It wasn't extravagant, but it was nice. Nicer than what I expected from him. I parked and walked up to his door, my heart pounding. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I clenched my jaw and reached for my phone, ready to call him again. And then, the door opened. But it wasn't Ethan standing there. It was her. The final blow. She was beautiful. The kind of effortless beauty that didn't require expensive makeup or designer clothes. She was fresh-faced, wearing one of Ethan's old hoodies, the one I used to steal from him when I was cold. And she was looking at me with pity. My stomach dropped. Can I help you? She asked, her voice calm. Too calm. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I started, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know why I was here anymore. What did I think was going to happen? That Ethan would see me and suddenly regret everything? That he'd realize he still wanted me, not her? That I could somehow win him back? The woman studied me for a moment, then sighed. Claire, she said softly, you need to stop. I flinched. She knew who I was. Of course she did. Ethan must have told her everything. And yet, there was no anger in her voice. No jealousy. No triumph. Just understanding. And that made it so much worse. I clenched my fists. Where's Ethan? She tilted her head slightly. He's not here. Lie. Right. I let out a hollow laugh. So what? You think you can replace me? She didn't react. She just gave me that same look. Like I was the one who was lost. Like I was the one who needed to move on. Like I was the one who had already been replaced. The words that ended it. Claire, she said gently. And for some reason that pissed me off even more. She had no right to say my name. No right to act like she understood me. I opened my mouth, ready to lash out, to say something, anything, that would wipe that look off her face. But then, I hope you find peace. The words were soft. Sincere. And somehow they cut deeper than any insult ever could. I took a step back, my chest tightening. This was it. This was the end. Because Ethan was gone. Really truly gone. And for the first time since this all started, I finally felt it that I don't remember driving home. One moment I was standing outside Ethan's apartment, staring at her, feeling the walls of my world cave in around me. The next I was back in my driveway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My mind kept replaying it, her standing in his hoodie, her voice soft but firm. Claire, you need to stop. I hope you find peace. Who the hell did she think she was? She spoke to me like I was a broken person. Like I was someone to be pitied. And the worst part? She was right. I was broken. And Ethan? He had moved on. Unraveling. The house was dark when I stepped inside, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Felt like a shell. A place I once ruled, once controlled. But now it was empty. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a drink. The wine burned down my throat, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. I had lost him. Really truly lost him. I had spent years believing Ethan needed me. That he was nothing without me. That I was the prize. But the truth? He was the one who had been holding me together. And now that he was gone, I had nothing. Desperation looks ugly on me. I should have let it go. I should have walked away, accepted the loss with grace. But I couldn't. Not when he was happy. Not when he was out there living his life like I had never mattered. I mattered. I had to. So I did something pathetic. I called him. Again. And again. And again. Each time it went straight to voicemail. Until finally, a message popped up. Ethan, Claire, stop. 2 words. That was all he gave me. And somehow that hurt more than silence ever could. The last straw. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. My vision blurred, but I didn't know if it was from rage or something worse. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan was supposed to be devastated without me. He was supposed to be the one calling, begging for another chance. But he wasn't. He had moved on. And suddenly I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only other number I could think of. David. The line rang twice before he picked up. His voice was sharp, annoyed. Claire. I swallowed, forcing confidence into my tone. Hey, what do you want? I flinched. He had never spoken to me like that before. I hesitated. I thought maybe we could. No. The word was final. Cold. And it sent pure panic through me. David, come on. I tried to laugh. You don't even. Claire, don't embarrass yourself. The breath left my lungs. Excuse me. You lost. Move on. And then he hung up. Just like that. Like I had never mattered. Like I was nothing. A life without me. I dropped the phone onto the counter and let out a shaky breath. David was gone. Ethan was gone. And I had no one left. For years I had believed I was the one in control. That I was the one making the choices. But the truth? I had never been in control at all. Ethan had been waiting for the right moment to leave. And now that he had, my life was unraveling faster than I could piece it back together. The house felt too big. Too empty. Because without Ethan, without someone to look down on, to manipulate, to push around, I was nothing. I curled up on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel powerful. I just felt alone. The house was unbearable. Every sound, every creak, every faint hum of the refrigerator felt deafening in the overwhelming silence Ethan had left behind. I had lived here for years, walked these halls like a queen, dictated the rhythm of our life together. But now it felt like a stranger's house. Or worse, a tomb. A tomb for the life I had lost. Because that's what this was. I had lost. Not just Ethan. Not just David. Everything. A world that kept moving without me. Days passed. Maybe weeks. I stopped checking the calendar. Stopped checking my emails. Stopped answering calls. I told myself I just needed time to process things. To grieve. But what I was really doing. I was waiting. Waiting for Ethan to call. Waiting for him to regret leaving me. Because he had to. Didn't he? No matter how much he thought he had moved on. No matter how much he pretended to be better off without me. At some point he'd realize. At some point he'd miss me. Right? But as time passed, that hope started rotting inside me. Because Ethan wasn't coming back. And I was starting to understand something truly horrifying. He didn't miss me at all. Desperation has a taste. One night, after too many glasses of wine, I caved. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I typed out a message. Me, can we talk? I hit send before I could stop myself. My heart pounded. My stomach twisted. I stared at the screen, waiting. Waiting. And then, a response. But not from Ethan. From her. Her. The woman in his hoodie. The woman standing in the doorway of his new life. Her. Claire, please stop. I saw red. The breaking point. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed my keys, barely registering the cold night air as I sped across town, straight to Ethan's apartment complex. By the time I reached his door, my breath was shallow, my vision blurred with anger, with something deeper than rage, something dangerously close to despair. I pounded on the door. I didn't care if I looked pathetic. I didn't care if this was beneath me. I needed to see him. I needed to remind him who I was. That I was Claire Carter. That I was the woman he had promised forever to. And she, whoever she was, would never be me. The door opened. But it wasn't Ethan. It was her. Again. Wearing his hoodie. Looking at me with the same damn pity. My breath hitched. Where is he? I demanded. She didn't flinch. Claire. Go home. No. 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 This wasn't how this was supposed to go. I wasn't supposed to be the one begging. Ethan. I yelled past her, trying to push forward. Ethan, come talk to me. Then I heard it. A voice from inside the apartment. But not his. A child's voice. Mom? Who's at the door? I froze. My body went cold. And then finally the final piece fell into place. The truth I never saw coming. The woman sighed, rubbing her temples. Claire, please. I stared at her. At the voice inside. At the apartment that wasn't just Ethan's. It was theirs. Not just her and him. Her. Him. Their child. Oh my God. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No. No, that's not. My voice broke. Because the realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't new. She wasn't new. Ethan hadn't moved on quickly. He had already been gone. For years. The fool I had been. I had thought I was the one sneaking around. The one keeping secrets. But Ethan? Ethan had a whole other life. A life I had never noticed. A life I had never even suspected. Because I had never truly looked at him. And suddenly, I wasn't the one who had walked away from a marriage. I was the one who had been left behind a long time ago. I staggered back another step. The woman, his woman, didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Because the truth was staring me in the face. Ethan had stopped loving me long before he left. And I had been too blind to see it. I turned and walked away, the cold night air burning my skin. For the first time in my life, I had nowhere to go. I don't remember the drive home. I don't remember pulling into the driveway, turning off the engine, or walking into the house. But suddenly I was standing in my kitchen. Alone in the dark, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The silence was deafening. The reality was suffocating. Ethan hadn't just moved on. He hadn't just left me. He had replaced me long ago. And I had been too arrogant, too blind to see it. The realization that broke me. I thought back to all the nights I had spent with David. The lies I had told. The secrets I had kept. I had always justified it. Ethan wasn't enough. Ethan was weak. Ethan was too comfortable, too boring. But now I understood something horrifying. I had stopped being his wife long before he stopped being my husband. I had treated him like a backup plan, a safety net, never realizing he had already cut the rope and walked away. He hadn't just signed those divorce papers out of spite. He had been waiting for that moment. And the second I gave it to him, he had walked away without looking back. The weight of the past. I stumbled into the living room, sinking onto the couch. For the first time in years I felt small. Not powerful. Not desired. Just empty. I thought back to our early years, before the resentment, before the condescension. Ethan used to love me. The kind of love that was quiet but steady. The kind of love that made him rub my feet after long days at work. Even when I barely said thank you. The kind of love that made him memorize my coffee order, my favorite book. The way I liked the sheets tucked on my side of the bed. I had taken it all for granted. And in the end, I had pushed him away so hard that I never even noticed when he stopped reaching for me. No one left to blame. For the first time there was no one left to lie to. Not Ethan. Not David. Not Kelsey. Just me. And the truth? I had done this to myself. I had made him stop loving me. I had told myself for years that Ethan was weak. That he needed me. That he could never walk away from me. But now, sitting in an empty house, staring at the empty space where his things used to be, I finally understood the truth. I was the weak one. I had spent years controlling him, manipulating him, believing I was better than him. But in the end, he was the one who had the strength to walk away. And I had been left behind.